All right, so welcome to another episode of my podcast. And this time we're going to be looking at how, in my view, conservatives exploit the fear of socialism and egalitarianism for their own ends. And I'm going to start off with saying something that is sort of conventional, shouldn't really be controversial. I'm going to say that with, some certainty, liberal democracy is the best possible system to achieve prosperity, social harmony, and individual freedoms, and that, in contrast, conservatism or far right ideology, or even a conservative leaning democracy, has much to offer to achieve culturally authoritarian goals, but is likely to lead to different, arguably more problematic outcomes. And yeah, I know that problematic is a bit of a buzzword, and some people will roll their eyes when they hear that term, but it actually does apply sometimes, and I think that really is true in this case. So, one aspect of it is the phenomenon of a caste system, which of course is a primary element of social division and authoritarianism, and it's frequently a part of any sort of social conservatism, the othering of various different groups. Insert group name here, and you will probably find there was at some point in history at least some marginal attempt to sort of treat that group as something other than the dominant group or than the desired group. This technically isn't just about the power dynamics at the top, because even technically groups who are marginalized can still engage in this type of thinking, like towards either other minority groups or however you want to look at it, or the those at the top. That it can go in multiple directions is basically what I'm saying here. So yeah. So a lot of this too has to do with familiarity and tradition, which is also sort of a weird cyclical thing that has us looking at history and current events and saying, wow, I've got déjà vu. Where have I seen this before? So, you get patterns of genocidal thinking and different wars and various conflicts and just random patterns of violence sometimes because of a difference in cultural opinions or what have you. And that has a lot to do with the fraying of the social fabric, which is frankly at the heart of a lot of conservative thought. Like, they actually thrive in a weird sort of way on chaos and disorder while claiming that they represent, order and law and order, in other words. So, if you want something that's, even marginally left, they will, the conservative movements out there will often simply say a knee-jerk reaction that you want communism or socialism. It doesn't necessarily mean you do, but that's kind of what they've been trained to say and to think about anyone who challenges any sort of right-wing ideology. It could just be that you want a sort of democratic and pluralist society. You might reject certain tenets of socialism, but that's not going to matter to these people. They've really been, I guess, indoctrinated into the belief that anyone to the left of so and so, including the almighty orange one, is a communist or a socialist, or sometimes they'll even use the word fascist without really understanding, the technical distinctions between communism and fascism, because it's oddly sort of like an apolitical political movement in a way. And fascism really thrives in that sort of confused environment where people, frankly don't even know what they're talking about half the time. It's largely ahistorical and really without any coherent philosophy other than the potential to implement sort of draconian policies and simply have societal violence. So there's a lot of people who question anything that's even slightly socialistic because they object to a political ideology that they say redistributes wealth from the rich to the poor. Although that's theoretically in stark contrast to a system where power and wealth flow from the powerful, or from the poor to the rich. That's the kind of system that the far right tends to actually embrace. And they see any sort of wealth redistribution idea and they instantly think, oh, it's bad. Even though, of course, even some of the very basic aspects of the economy basically require some wealth to be divided, to the common folk. It can't all go up to the wealthy people. So how are you going to ensure that the ultra rich are not just going to rip everybody off every step of the way? Well, what do you know? That's where that law and order idea kind of comes in, potentially. But the wealthy, the ultra rich, and the mega donors to the two-party system in the United States, they don't really like that idea. So they have really set us on a potentially devastating course. And of course, being that they are ahistorical, they don't really understand that even somebody like Karl Marx, he actually yes, he advocated for communism, but he actually believed that the state would wither away at a certain point, right? So communism was not just a way to treat government as an end unto itself. They actually had sort of a utopian aim going on. And, the alternative to that, we are told the antidote is to just give all the power to the rich, all the resources, all of the media, basically all the education system, everything, just hand it over to the ultra rich because they obviously know what they're doing, right? Even though we've seen time and time again that they will rip people off, they will rob them blind, they will break all of the laws that they can, sometimes just for fun. They're corrupt. They have a lot of crony capitalism going on as opposed to, like a meritocracy. They really like to use the government to their advantage too, so that it's not like they're actually truly anti-government or anything like that. Like even if you actually look at the tax proposals of the Republican Party, like the most radical plan is a national sales tax to replace the income tax for a lot of these people. So that means that they're actually not even truly anti-taxation. They just want to shift the tax burden over to the general population even more than it already is. So that's really kind of revealing that they're not even truly against the government, even though the Democratic Party and the conventional liberals will constantly try to depict them as anti-government radicals or whatever. But actually, like, a lot of them actually love the government. They love how the government actually props up corporations and the military-industrial complex and private prisons and all kinds of stuff like that. And of course, the government will be used to implement the social conservative agenda, as it already has been. That's not been left up to the free market. Like the repeal of Roe versus Wade, They've used that to implement policies on a state level, and they're trying to do that on the national level too. So even though they will criticize the federal government when it's convenient for them to do so, they'll turn right around and say, "Hey, let's implement this on the national level." So all of a sudden, their talk about states' rights being so important kind of goes away when it's to their advantage. It's really kind of funny like that. It reminds me of how on Charlie Brown, well, everybody's heard this analogy probably, but Lucy will put the football at, isn't that Lucy? I think that's her name. But anyway, that one bitchy character will put the football down, and Charlie Brown will try to run at it, and then she'll yank it away. Well, that's kind of like how they swindle people when it comes to the concept of states' rights versus federal rights. That they'll make it seem like they're actually radical and like cool or rebellious or whatever, but they're truly not. They're not anti-government on really any significant wavelength. So don't buy all this hype about them being like some cool radical anarchist types or whatever. It's pretty far from the truth. Okay, so when it comes to state-sponsored welfare, the welfare state or moral activism that has anything to do with liberals and leftism, conservatives will spin that to say that liberal democracies are embracing a more restrictive set of cultural values or ideals, and they'll treat it as if it's being actually illiberal as a democracy or something like that. And they will claim that those aims are authoritarian simply because they call out political power. And of course, they'll take out the inevitable. They'll take out the inevitable example of, like a leftist going too far and condemning like a movie or something like that, and they'll say, "Oh, see how stupid political correctness is," or whatever. When really, like it's at the end of the day just a matter of opinions. It's a difference of opinion, and it might not always be extreme all the time. Like now the narrative has shifted. It used to be against cancel culture that they were railing against, while hypocritically engaging in cancel culture all the time. Remember, Bill Maher was basically canceled back in the day for his comments on how war was being conducted and things like that. So there was always like some far-right attempts to cancel people who were liberal or on the left. And, that's really been these days almost like set aside. That's no longer really the issue for them. The main issue now is simply that there are black people and gay people in movies at all or stuff like that. Like that's one of the things that these far right people are actually complaining about. And if you don't believe that, go ahead and look it up online. And one of the other signs of that is we've had politicians who were associated with the far right. Like there was one recently who was actually voted out of office because he was revealed as a neo-Nazi, and I might do an episode on that later later on in the future. But you can find stories like that. It's a pretty common thing these days, and the main complaint right now is this DEI thing that they're diversity. How does that go? Diversity something or other and inclusion. That's like what they're all worked up about. As if that's such a controversial idea. But if you really look at all of this stuff in history, certain strains of leftism have led to authoritarianism. Like Stalinism, of course. North Korea. You could point to North Korea, to some degree Cuba, and a few other countries too, of course. But many of the authoritarian regimes that rose to power in history before, during, and after World War II were actually more conservative and not liberal. So it would make sense for the conservatives to note that as well if they're being fair. And conservatives will also say that liberal and leftist movements associated with globalism are scary, though, of course, the far right is also engaged globally, including through corporate power and military power. They just don't like structures that have, to some degree, rejected cultural conservatism and embraced some of the values of liberalism. They've they've employed cultural conservatism in the service of their political objectives, which is largely what conservative means at this point. It's not really about principles so much as it is about power. They can easily set principles aside whenever it's convenient, as I've already mentioned. And many of the established so-called strongmen or authoritarian leaders have been part of the military, including Saddam Hussein, and other of these great, incredible, majestic leaders. They don't represent, liberal values necessarily. They tend to represent conformity more than they do any sort of far left principles. And that's one of the biggest weaknesses of conservatism overall, is that time and time again, the appeal to tradition leads to exactly that. This embracing of authoritarian strongman types, and it really comes at the expense of intellectualism generally. And I think at the end of the day, it ends up being self-refuting, but because it relies on brutal force, a lot of people go along with it anyway. And that's really one of the tragedies of authoritarianism, is that it's very tough to not become one once that ball has got rolling. If you reject the status quo, well, you might get squashed or imprisoned, or something bad might happen to you. You might have to, at the very least, keep your head down, so to speak. But anyway, that's really all I have to say about it now. I've probably said some of these points before here. But, all right. Have a good day.